You're listening to the Pulled by the Root podcast.
All right. Well, welcome to Pulled by the Root. I'm Al, and Amy's with me, of course. And our guest today is Julia. Julia was adopted in September of 1963 under the New Zealand closed adoption policy of sealed records. She grew up knowing she was adopted, but was unable to search for her real family until the 1980s, after the law was changed to allow adult adoptees access to their original birth certificates. She was able to trace her mother in the United Kingdom. However, to this day, her mother has not wanted a relationship with her. It took a great deal more sleuthing to find her father, who was an American citizen of First Nations descent living in North Carolina. She has a large extended family in the US and has made many trips with her children to visit there. Married to her sweetheart, Mike, she is a mother of 4, stepmother of 2, and a recent grandmother to an 8-month-old baby girl with a grandson due in October. Of particular interest to Julia is the lifelong effects of being adopted on intimate relationships, a topic she explored for her master's degree. A trained counselor working with young people, she is currently completing a doctorate on how being adopted might affect the experience of parenting one's own biological children as adopted people. Welcome, Julia.
Wonderful to be here.
So glad you are. I have so many questions. The information that you sent, the paper and all the reference and things. But maybe first though, I did the little bio, we know a bit of your journey, but maybe you could fill it in a little bit more before we get into your research.
Certainly. So I'm very conscious that, like many adopted people in the Western world, we were placed for adoption into a system that closed the records. So I grew up knowing that I was adopted. My adoptive parents certainly had told my sister and myself right from before we were aware what adoption was. We always knew that we were different and we were adopted, but we didn't know who we were. We had no access to any information about ourselves. And as you said at the beginning, Al, New Zealand amended our 1955 Adoption Act in the 1980s, and I was a young woman. I was in my early 20s. The law was amended to allow me to apply for my original birth certificate that had my birth mother's name. That was all. So it was enough to start being able to trace her. And I was a very, very good adopted person, and I didn't want to cause my adoptive parents any pain, or I felt very loyal to them and still do. So I was very, very secretive about doing that search. I didn't tell them. I didn't tell my then husband. So I applied for it, my original birth certificate, and received that in the mail. And then it was pre-internet, so I set off to find her using electoral rolls, and eventually located her through a long and tortuous journey to find that she had in fact left New Zealand shortly after my birth and had gone to the United Kingdom. This was around the time that I became pregnant with my first child, and that is of relevance to the later, more academic journey that I've gone on. So I was pursuing my identity, my real identity in terms of an adopted person, at the same time that I was becoming pregnant and having children. And even though all of my friends and classmates went off to university and studying, all I wanted to do was to have a child. That was the only thing that mattered to me, which was kind of unusual back then. Everyone was expected from my year to go off to university and study and have a glittering career and so on. So I eventually managed to trace my mother write her a letter. She eventually responded after about 5 months with a very guarded acknowledgement that I was her daughter. She never used the D for daughter word, but in fact, she was who I thought she was, that it had unearthed a whole lot of long buried pain for her. And she was very much intending to keep me at arm's length, that she had not told anybody. She had not told her husband, her son, and she didn't intend to. But given that I was literally across the other side of the world, she wanted to keep me way out of sight. And then I heard nothing again from her at all. So I wrote back, but she didn't respond. That was devastating, absolutely devastating. And I certainly hadn't anticipated that she would respond like that. I had yearned and fantasized about her for my whole life. I had looked at the faces of people in buses wondering, are you my mother? Are you my mother? Why do I look so different? Why am I so different? All of the things that we do as adopted people. And so for her to say, yeah, no, that's a Kiwi expression. Yeah, no, I acknowledge who you are, but I want nothing to do with you. It was a very excruciating pain. And at that point in my early 20s, I didn't understand what happened for me then, because what happened was that a whole lot of things were set in train inside of myself very deeply. And I distracted myself with being a good mom, being a good wife, being a good person, but it really hurt. It set me on a trajectory of a lot of pain and self-harm, a grumbling eating disorder kind of grew into a full-blown eating disorder, and feeling quite suicidal at times. However, I had my babies, and so I wasn't going to leave my babies. So I got on with being a mother, and my relationship with my husband, my children's father, had been somewhat fragile, and I wasn't very good at intimacy. I wasn't very good at being real and knowing how to attach to a person. And eventually we ended up in a marriage counsellor's office because our marriage was very, very shaky. And it was in the context of a marriage counselling session that the marriage counsellor, so this was in the early 90s by then, and I had 3 little children with my husband. And the marriage counsellor said to me, Julia, there's just been this book that's been published, and I've photocopied a chapter of it, and I want you to take it home and read it. And I said, because I was a very good girl, okay, what's it about? He said, it's about adoption. And I remember being really affronted that he would think, the nerve of this man to think that my issues in my marriage had anything to do with being adopted, because my husband wasn't adopted, so therefore clearly everything was my fault. And so I very politely said, sure, I'll take it home. So I did. I took it home and I went upstairs and I started to read, and it was a chapter out of Nancy Verrier's The Primal Wound. And I'd never read anything about adoption before. She'd only published it recently. That's how old I am. I started to read it, and the word abandonment leapt off the page and hit me between the eyes, and it felt like a physical blow. I had never seen that word abandonment. And I started to cry. And I cried and I cried, and I had no idea why I was crying. I had no idea why this word had just sucker punched me. Even in I was quite unwell. I was very thin. I hadn't been eating. My marriage was on the rocks. I was trying to be a perfect mother and dissociate from all of the things inside of me and still be a great mom to my little children. I knew there was something about this word abandonment that had unearthed something very deep. And so that propelled me into an adoption support group, which we held here in my hometown. And in that, I was very frightened about going, very frightened about someone recognizing me and knowing that I was adopted, because it was not something anyone ever talked about until I'd read Nancy's book. When I plucked up the courage to go to this group, and for the first time ever heard another adopted person talking, and the support that I got in that group, they held my hand, they validated what I was feeling, they made me feel safe, they made me feel like I wasn't the only creature on this entire planet for whom adoption was a thing, it mattered. And I'm really, really condensing the story, but with the support of that group, I plucked up the courage to look for my father, because I figured, well, my mother doesn't want me. The worst that can happen is that he doesn't want me either. And I kind of always thought my mother would want me. And if he doesn't want me, okay, I think I can handle that. And with the support of this group, I, again, pre-internet, I took 5 months to find him. I had my mother, when she had very little contact with me, she had at least given me his name, and I was very, very lucky that she did, because I know that a lot of birth mothers either don't know the name, or if they know the name, they don't want to disclose that. So I was hugely fortunate. She gave me his name, and she said she thought he came from either North or South Carolina, and that he had always talked about his sisters. He had sisters. Now, the story of how they met, he was American, he was in the military, and he had come down to New Zealand, which is a very long way from the United States. He was doing his compulsory military training. He was in the middle of a law degree, and he'd come down on the USS Staten Island, which was an icebreaker coming down to Antarctica, or the Antarctic, as you guys say. So he was looking gorgeous in his beautiful military uniform. And they met in a coffee shop in my hometown, and she was a university student and musical and loved speaking French, and he loved French as well, and he was a guitarist and very musical, and they had fallen in love in the summer of 1962, and I was, hatched, conceived, and then he'd gone off on this big icebreaker down to the Antarctic, and they'd written to each other many, many times a week. They'd, fallen head over heels, and she had kept all his letters. So I went to the UK on one occasion and met her, and she gave me all of his letters, which were tied up with a pink ribbon. So on some level, I knew that he had mattered to her. So they had this relationship. She had denied that she was pregnant. He'd asked her by letter, and she said, no, I'm not pregnant, but she was. So after he'd been down in Antarctica, he left and went back to San Diego, where he was stationed, and she gave birth to me in the September, sat her final university exams because she was right at the end of her undergraduate degree, and then came to the States to be with him. And they lived together for a while on the West Coast, and she worked in UCLA library. And then the story goes, and I've heard it from her and I've heard it from him, so I think it's what transpired. They had a very big argument one night. He said she was flirting with the pizza delivery guy, and things got heated. And in the course of this argument, she said, you know what? I was pregnant. I did have a baby girl, and I left behind in New Zealand. And he said, and he told me this many, many, many years later, he said, with absolute incredulity and horror, how could any woman ever give her own child away? Oh. And so, the relationship completely ruptured. And she left and went to England and never came back to New Zealand, never saw him again. And he knew, my dad knew that there was a baby girl in New Zealand, and he had no way of finding me because I had by then obviously been adopted, and I had a new identity and a new legal name, and he would never have been able to find me. So fast forward to 1994, I'm back in the support group. I've had this love and understanding and some strength. And I'd also been in treatment for the eating disorder. And so when I finally, through a bit of a fluke through the Department of Motor Vehicles, who some clerk on the day must have been not paying attention and actually gave me some information that she probably should not have. I wrote a bunch of letters to a whole lot of people with his name. And on this particular day in November 1994, the phone rang. I was cooking dinner. It was, 3 children under 7, they all were. And this very beautiful woman's voice said, "Hello, is this Julia?" And I said, "Yes." She said, "I think you found your father." And she was my father's wife. He had received my letter, and I had worded it, as you do as an adopted person, very carefully. And so she put me on the phone to my father.
Oh, wow.
And interesting, after all this time, it still makes me want to cry. So the response that I got from my father was huge. He was overjoyed that I had found him. He had had an interesting journey in his life with a lot of challenges. He was quite estranged from his 3 children. I have a brother 3 years younger than me and 2 sisters younger again. He had grown up in an intergenerational pattern of difficulty in relationship and addiction, and he'd had a lot of struggles in his life, and he didn't have any grandchildren, and so suddenly here was this strange creature from the other side of the world that he associated with this love affair that he had all those years ago. And I had 3 children and 1 on the way. So we began our connection by phone, and then the next year he came out to New Zealand with his wife and one of my aunties and her husband, and we met. Now, other than my mother and my children, he was the first, he was a biological relative. And over the next 25 years, as I would take my children to just out of Charlotte, North Carolina, he lived in a little town out of Charlotte. He was one of 7, and his mother, who had had him when she was 14, so he was the oldest of 7 children, she had been one of 9 children. And I even met my great-grandmother, who, when I met her for the first time, she was 97, and I remember thinking, oh my goodness, I'm so lucky to be able to meet her before she passes at 97. She lived to be 108.
Gosh.
I got to meet her so many times and take my children there. And for me, it was a miracle that the photographs of my aunties and uncles as children looked like photos of my children. And I still think it's a miracle. It's not a miracle, it's biology, it's genetics. But for me, it was astonishing. And my father's family just embraced us and claimed us. They claimed us. They claimed me. They claimed my children. I really struggled. I felt like in the story of the ugly duckling, where the ugly duckling sees the swans flying overhead, and in the fairy story, The Ugly Duckling, there's a line that says, so the ugly duckling saw the swans and thought, what beautiful creatures, and her heart broke and leapt at the same time. And when I was with my family, each time in America, I looked like my aunties. They were strong and funny and sassy and confident and really, really very strong women. And I was not. I was quite a different sort of person at that time. But I could see myself. And my father looked at me and saw them, but he also saw my mother. And so he and I developed a really, really close, really deep relationship. And we talked about everything and anything. And he saw my children and he saw that genetic legacy. My father was colorblind, and all three of my sons, I have 4 children, 3 boys and a girl, all my sons are colorblind. And it's passed on through me genetically. There were so many connections. There were connections that were musical and spiritual and physical, and it was life-changing. And it continues to be life-changing for me. So that's the edited version of my American connection. So I still feel half American and half human.
Sure.
I didn't belong there. Every time I opened my mouth, I was a Kiwi. We New Zealanders, I was Kiwi. I sounded different. I had a different cultural experience. I felt like someone from outer space. But when I was with my family, I felt so much that I belonged, but I didn't belong. So my heart would leap and break at the same time. But for my kids, they didn't have any of that baggage. They didn't have the pain of relinquishment. They thought it was unbelievably cool to be part of this bigger extended family and belong in both worlds. But it was much more complex for me. So that's my backstory.
Thank you. It's when you were describing how it was finally to look like somebody, not just your children. And that sounds terrible. I hate the word just in those instances. But when you feel like maybe you sprang out of nowhere, and then you have your children that do resemble you, but to go backwards and see that you resemble these people, it's an unbelievable thing. I don't know about you, Amy, but to me, those moments were intense.
Very intense. And like you said, Julia, how as a child, right, on the surface, you looked like everything was fine, but you were scanning the faces of the women just to see, do I look like that person? And the wondering of who do I look like? And that was one of the biggest things for myself growing up. But I want to, first, I want to say I'm really sorry also about your rejection from your birth mother. I could see in your face that is still really deep. But then on the flip side, when I saw you talking about your birth father and what he has brought to your family and your children, your face just lit up, and it just warmed my heart and gave me chills at the same time, just to know that it's so important to adopted people to be able to see that connection and get that love and get that acceptance beyond anything. So thank you so much for sharing all those details with us.
You're very welcome. Very welcome. It feels on one level when you talk to kept people, to those who weren't adopted out, sometimes it can sound like it's a superficial thing, like I just want to look like someone else. For me, yes, it was absolutely the surface thing of how I look, my size, my height, my hair, my eyes, the physical things. But that was about 5% of it. It was things that are so taken for granted by the kept. It was when I was tracing my mother, and I hadn't realized at that point yet that she'd left New Zealand. I managed to find her brother, my uncle, and he didn't know his sister had ever had a baby. So I organized a meeting through an intermediary And my uncle Graham had said to the intermediary, I think this girl's got it wrong. Like, my sister never had a child. And the intermediary said, well, she's got a birth certificate and evidence, so I think you should meet her. And so when I went to meet my uncle for that very first time, I took my birth certificate. But as soon as I walked into his office, he said, oh, right. Yeah, no, you don't. I see my sister. Not that I so much physically resembled, because I look much more like my father's sisters, but the turn of my head, the way I spoke, my mannerisms, my gestures, so those sorts of things, but also with things like mood, and psychologically, I was quite a broody, moody kind of person, and my father was a very broody, moody kind of person. The music, the creativity, the way our little pinky toes were the same, the way we thought about things, just myriad things that kept people don't see, because fish don't notice the water. When
It's
you're
so
the
true.
water, you don't know it's there, because that's your universe. But when you grow up in a family where it's like a cat growing up with a family of dogs, I tried really hard to be a good dog, but I was really cat-like, and I always felt wrong. And my adoptive parents were very attractive, kind of Grace Kelly and Prince Charles kind of looking people when they were unable to have children, so they were infertile. And I would look at them, and I was a very ugly duckling as a child. No, trust me on this. And that runs really deep for a young person in terms of identity. And I would look at my adoptive parents and just feel so bad that they had adopted such an ugly child, if they had been able to have their own child. And I thought about this incessantly. I felt guilty for not being pretty, and guilty for not looking like their own child would have looked. But I never voiced that. I would never have told a single soul. As I've gotten older and stronger, I felt safer to talk about what my reality was as a young person and as a woman growing up. And now, even approaching my 60th trip around the sun, I feel so much stronger in myself to say, hey, this is what my lived experience was. I looked so put together. I looked so adaptive and functional and articulate and a leader and blah, 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 blah. But actually, I hated who I was and who I wasn't. And it was my dad's belief in me, because he could see strength. I think he was projecting his sister's strength and looked at me, and he felt really sad that I was so broken inside. And the relationship with him and with my aunties that I got to know and love was very, very healing. Very healing.
That's amazing. That, like, having that connection where somebody who you are kin with accepts you like that then, and loves you into more wholeness. Now, what you just said brings me to your research, because one of the things that I noticed as I was reading through it and the different studies that you cite, it says many of them will say something like most adoptees do quite well, or most adoptees are well adjusted, right? And all I could think of was how that's such a surface thing. And and now you're just like, I looked great on the outside, because I was also moody and broody, and I was not a pleasant teenager. I was like, the punk goth kid in the 80s, listening to the Smiths and but I would vacillate back and forth between trying to be good, the good adoptee, realizing I don't know how to be winsome and all the things that my adopting mother liked. I wasn't outgoing, and I wasn't, the word winsome, it just, anyway. And so then I would rebel and I would like cycle around, right? But I think to many people, it seemed like I had it together because I know how to dress myself. I know, whatever. And I got married young. I also had children and things like that. But underneath, it was eating disorder and it was self-harm and it was suicidal ideation and it was all sorts of things, right? And so reading through your paper and all of that just made me think, so often people are just like, nope, looks good on the outside. It's all good. We'll just keep going and keep doing the thing that we've always been doing, and nothing's wrong here, nothing to see.
Yeah.
So I'm just fascinated by your study and those issues of connection, or what is actually happening underneath the surface.
I could talk about this until the cows come home. I love that word, Al, winsome. Yeah, winsome. It's not a word we would use over here, but I've read it. And yeah, I think that we are very, very good at adapting.
Mm-hmm.
Adoption means adaptation, and we try so hard to fit in and belong. We become consummate actors. We really do. I did manage winsome. I was not the rebellious. You know how there's kind of this binary of adopted people either act out or act
Yes.
in. I was very much the act in and very busy being perfect because, my older sister, who's also adopted, she acted out quite a bit and ran away and was quite oppositional at times.
Mm-hmm.
And I would look at that and think, oh, I'd better be really good. And of course, you're always thinking, if I'm not really good, I'll go back to the orphanage, because the discourse around being chosen, and your parents go to the hospital and look at all the babies and they choose you. And this was the story one grew up with. So in the back of one's mind, well, I've been not okay initially. If I'm not okay now, maybe they'll give me back and then I'll get adopted by someone else. And so I was very busy being good. So many things. I absolutely take your point, Elle. When I was doing my master's research, it pretty much involved looking at all of the literature around. What I decided to study was what has been studied about adopted people and intimate relationships with partners and children. And it was very, very personal to me because I had a trail of littered relationships along the path. So my relationship with my children's dad had finally ended, and I'd remarried, and that relationship ended, and then I'd had a series of relationships and realized I really sucked at relationships. I was not able to be real. I was still acting and adaptive and trying to be perfect, and I couldn't attach in any meaningful way. I was really, really scared of being close to anyone and letting them see who I really was, because who I really was felt like a very blackened, charred husk of a person. I did quite a lot of therapy work on myself, read throughout the 90s and 2000s. We brought Nancy out to New Zealand, Nancy Veria, for a conference. Essentially, I got involved in the adoption world. There I found people who were like me. We organised support groups and a newsletter, and again, it was just as the internet was starting to happen. So until the internet happened, it was a way of connecting with other adoptees. Nancy came out, Marcy Weinman-Exness, who was enormously influential, her writing. Marcy is an amazing human, another adopted person. So all of that had been bubbling away, but I didn't do my master's research in it until 2017, when I was retraining to become a counsellor, because I'd had some other careers prior to that. And what led me to start looking at the academic research was that I kind of, after all these years, I'm in my 50s by now, and I'm thinking, looking back across my life, what was going on for me? There had to be something going on for me. What if it was connected to being adopted, and what does the literature say? And I really want to understand it, because by now I was married for the third time, and I really, really, really didn't want to shake this one up. Because as I said in my bio at the beginning, he's a sweetheart, and there was a very deep spiritual connection to him, and I didn't want to, no profanities, Julia. I really wanted this relationship to last. It was very important to me. And I knew that my connection to my 4 children was the deepest, most profound connection I'd ever known. And I didn't know if other humans, kept humans, had that with other people in their lives, or was it just me with my children? Like, what was that about? So I was curious, I guess, being curious. And that's a good reason to sort of dip your toes into academia. So I looked at the literature, and yeah, like you said, Al, most of the literature reports, most adopted people are pretty well adjusted. Hooray. And I thought, okay, maybe I'm just a really bad adoptee. But as I looked more into the literature, there are 2 flavors of research. One is quantitative, where people answer questionnaires and they're asked very simple, like yes-no questions, or on a scale of 1 to 10, and that's quantitative stuff that you can measure. And then there's the other flavor of research, which is qualitative. So tell me about that. What was that like for you? What is the narrative around that? So qualitative research is quite a different kind of way of understanding the world. And when I looked at the qualitative research around adoption, that's a whole other barrel of monkeys, guys. So I also learned that a lot of research that had been done on adopted people was done by social scientists who were not adopted. And I found that interesting. And there's a quite a famous adoption activist from many, many years back, a woman called Jean Patton. And she said famously, all of the research has been done by people who are not adopted. And the voices of adopted people are the voices that need to be heard. And you guys in the United States and North America have led the way in that. The cohort of children born during and after the Korean War, so Korean adoptees, a lot of research came out of the 80s, the 1980s, and it started to question some of the assumptions that had been made about adopted people. However, when you look at the academic research, even though there are statements, as you've said, Al, that the vast majority of adopted people do well, if you had interviewed me as a quantitative researcher, you'd have said, oh, she's doing really well. She's married, she's got children, she's got a great job, great house, on all the indicators of well-being. I would have come across very well put together, very well adjusted, university education, socioeconomically doing fine. So I do believe that the research hasn't necessarily told the story of what our lived experience is. So then I started to move much towards that qualitative, what was really going on for you. So in my master's, I looked at, is there research about intimate relationships? Yes, there is a bit. And it's mostly around intimate romantic relationships with partners. And that's where all the work around attachment sits, because we very much attach to a romantic partner in the same way that we experienced attachment as little people. And as I said, adopted people, not especially good at attachment.
I don't know.
Yeah.
Yes, no, absolutely.
If you're lucky enough to be in a relationship with a securely attached person, that can be a game changer. And I would encourage anyone who hasn't looked into this area of attachment to just do a little bit of a dip your toes in and learn a little bit about your attachment style, because it does tend to link quite profoundly into trust and core beliefs about being lovable and being left. I tended to leave relationships, just get in early before they could leave me. Turns out they didn't want to leave me, but I totally believed they would. And I still struggle with that, and I have to remind myself what I've learned. But the other part that I looked at was, what's the research saying about the intimacy of a parent-child relationship? And I found there was not a lot of research in that area. Only a very few studies, and they were qualitative. So there was definitely a gap in the literature. So I decided, hey, this feels really, really interesting, and I'm super curious. And so I thought, I want to learn more about this. And so that's what started me off on this project that I'm hopefully going to complete later this year, on looking at how being adopted affects your relationship with your own biological children across the lifespan. So not just when you have the baby and it's a little new person, or, the pregnancy and the birth. So that the research that's out there that I read was pretty much focused on those very early, the pregnancy, thinking about becoming pregnant, being pregnant, giving birth, and the early days. But I wanted to look across the lifespan as our children grow and go through all those developmental stages, what comes up for us and what's going on in the adoption space.
That is so interesting, because a few episodes ago, I was on here with Heidi and Amy, but I was being interviewed at that point. And we brought up our kids, because all of our kids are grown. And Heidi asked something like, how did she put it, Amy? Something about how did she think we parented? Like, did we hover, or were we aloof? And I just said, well, I have a feeling that I've been more aloof. I love them dearly, and we're very close, and yet I feel like maybe they would have liked more hugs and kisses and more, the mushy gushy things. But I said, but you can interview them and I won't listen.
Exactly.
I don't think I want to know anymore. But Julia, what have you been finding then? Say, in terms of kids who are further on in their life journey, like mine the twins are 23 and our oldest is 27. Like, what are you finding with adult children of adopted folk?
Yes.
So I haven't been looking at the children. I've been looking at the adopted.
Let's flip it.
But
then. What have you learned about?
I done a wee grin to myself, because my supervisor literally emailed me a few days ago. She's a psychology professor in Auckland. You would say Auckland. She is North American as well. And she emailed me the other day and she said, Julia, I've got a master's student who wants to look at the children of adopted people. And that's why I smiled when you said that. There's definitely some stuff there. And every single one of the participants in the study that I've done did say, I think my kids would want to speak to this. So there's definitely going to be some research happening in that space.
Interesting collaboration possibilities there for you. So, so what did you notice, and what have you been noticing about us as adoptees as we parent and as we
how long do we have, my dear?
I wish we could go long form. We're gonna get you back because
well, once my dissertation is submitted, I'll give you all a little taster,
a sneak peek.
One of the ways that I structured my study, initially I thought I was going to do a really big study and interview lots and lots lots and lots of adopted people, but I very quickly learned that when you ask these kinds of questions, it's huge. So I ended up with 8 participants, and I am the 9th. So the structure of my study is called an autoethnographic study, which means that I, as the researcher, am one of the studied population, and I'm including myself as a participant and also a researcher. So I'm wearing a couple of hats.
Yeah.
I'm a researcher, I'm an adopted person, and I wore another hat, which is I'm also a therapist, a counsellor. So at times in the interview situation, I was functioning in a counselling way, because things, as you know, when you talk about this area, do come up for people. One of the really important things that I've found, which will not come as any surprise to an adopted person who is in their, as I am, late 50s, I'll be 60 in September, our 60s and 70s, is that adoption has never gone away. Adoption has always been there in the background, and for my participants and myself, the further along our life journey we have gone, the more we can look back and say, oh, yeah, that was adoption. Oh, yeah, I think that was adoption too. And the reasons that things were happening for me, I didn't see it at the time, but the further away from it I get, the clearer I can see it. Like when you go up in a helicopter and look down on something, you see it in a different way and see it more clearly. So one of the themes that's come up over and over and over again is people, as they've reflected on what was happening for them as in their parenting journey, was, and that was adoption too. And adoption in the sense of feeling either really connected or really disconnected. A lot of fear. Fear is a very common thread through all of this. Fear of losing the child, fear of rupture in the relationship, needing to always let the child do what the child wanted, because if the child rejected the parent, that would be intolerable. So difficulty with boundaries around, parenting boundaries, putting those in place. Devastation at transitions, going to school, leaving home. It's very typical to feel sad and empty nest syndrome when our children leave home. For adopted people, a whole other level. As I looked at the different stages of children growing up, the newborn, the infanthood, the toddlerhood, the school-age children, adolescents, noticing that what was happening for their child was bringing up what had been going on for them at that same developmental stage. Really, really fascinating. Getting triggered, and giving birth to a daughter seemed to be particularly triggering. Of my mother, I'm my mother's daughter, and she gave me away. So it's absolutely rich with information, and I had some incredibly articulate and thoughtful, reflective participants. So it's a huge privilege to have these voices of adopted people and myself reflecting on how adoption has woven in, and how our very initial experience in life of severance, being cut off from who we were, has continued to bubble away underneath of us throughout the whole landscape of our lives.
Yes.
I'm really going to be sad when I finish, kind of relieved as well, because it's been a big work, but I'm just finding it so helpful to myself and so interesting, and I hope that it will be a useful piece of work for adopted people, for those who love adopted people, for their sons and daughters, and perhaps their grandsons and granddaughters, and for therapists who, certainly in New Zealand, there are not a lot of adoption competent professionals who really understand what the core issues are for us and know where to look, where to stay, and where to hold the space for someone. whereas unfortunately, a lot of psychologists, counsellors, therapists probably just buy into that whole societal discourse of, oh, you're so lucky, you were chosen, and how special that is, and not realise there's a whole lot going on for us under the surface. So I hope it will be a useful piece of research to just shed light on there are other aspects to this that the kept don't necessarily have any understanding.
Yeah,
Exactly.
it's so true. I'm so excited for it because I do think it is a huge hole in the whole narrative of what it is like. Like you said, well, here in Canada, it took a long time for me to find somebody, a therapist who was adoption competent and not in the, oh, I love adoption, I have 3 of my own. Like like there's a bit of a difference there. And he isn't even, I'm actually teaching him, but he's open to it.
Right.
What drew me to him is because I have a few things going on, as many adoptees do. He was competent with religious trauma.
Yeah.
And I needed either one, both, either, but at least he was that, and he's willing to learn. But like you said, there's not a lot. They do sort of seem to go with the regular trope.
Yeah. I was just going to say, Julia, I think this will bring a lot to many. And I'm sure your research with the adoptees, the 8 adoptees that you were able to kind of, get deep with, right? These questions are not easy. And to have them be open and honest with you, just like you had mentioned how you were in support groups early on, which I've recently just found. I mean, this project for you, this doctorate, has to be an absolutely comforting thing, almost in a way, to feel they're saying that. Oh my gosh, that's exactly a moment of how I felt, right?
So validating. Validating.
And I think that's something that as adoptees, we're all looking for, is that validation and that piece of just acknowledgement that we do have these feelings that are kind of buried right below the surface, right? We're all put together, but they're always there with us and they really don't go away. So I am so fascinated, and maybe when you do complete your paper, we could have you come back on and dive a little deeper into that.
I would love to do that. I would love to. Yeah. I really hope it's going to be useful to others. I know how useful it's been to myself. Yeah, I'm definitely hoping it will be a very useful but also honouring of our lived experience, that adoption it's not just a little baby in a crib and place it in a new family and everybody lives happily ever after. It's complicated and it's lifelong. And ask us. We know what our lived experience is.
Exactly.
And those who love us, the kept. So my sweetheart, he's still learning. And often my participants would talk about their partners or, spouses. And even after many, many years of marriage, still, or being in relationships, still trying to work out what's going on for their adopted partner. And so for the adopted partner to learn more about themselves in terms of attachment, in terms of what we believe about ourselves, really useful to strengthen your relationship with your loved ones, whether it's partners or children. I really believe understanding knowledge is power. And then you still have to do the work.
Exactly. I love how you just finished all what you said about our partners and learning. And is there anything else that maybe we didn't touch on today that you would like to share with us before we go?
I feel like if I start talking again, you probably won't stop me. But just that it has been so special for me all the way down here in New Zealand, the land of the hobbits. You'll have heard of the Lord of the Rings, and that's certainly put New Zealand a bit more on the international globe. But what I have found in some Facebook groups that I've joined, the voices of adopted people in those groups are so honest and so real. And it's really echoed for me what I discovered in the 1990s, before the internet,
Mhm.
being with others, other adopted people, seeing and recognizing, and as you said, validating, you're not crazy. You've had to adapt to a crazy situation, being a little puppy placed in a cat family or, whatever. And you've done the best that you could. You did the best that you could with what you knew. And it was a profoundly unnatural thing to do. So self-compassion is something I'm still learning about, but I have to start going back to that little girl, Julia, understanding that she was doing the best that she could, but she didn't have all the information, and we were going blind, weren't we? And it's amazing that our children don't have to go through that. So one of the most special things that I've been able to do for my children is give them this family forest. They've got their adoptive family, the family that I grew up with, but this enormous biological aunties and uncles and great aunts and cousins and grandparents, and they see themselves reflected in that, and that really, really matters to me.
Yes, that's so special. Thank you so much. We really appreciate the time that you spent with us and all the information that you gave us. And when do you see yourself completing your, I know it's hit or miss, but just because we're going to follow up with you. So
Exactly. We want you back.
In my head, I wanted to be finished by September because it's a nice birthday for me. It's I was born in 63. I'll be 60 in September. So that's kind of inside of myself, my goal, but I don't need to submit till next March, and it depends on life. Life's a bit busy at the moment. So
right, exactly.
fingers crossed, it might be September.
Okay. Well, you just keep us up to date.
Yes,
keep
please.
us, definitely.
Keep sending things, and want to talk again.